Coming up in today's podcast.
I think that one thing too that separates from like mainstream Christianity with Mormonism, and it sounds like it's the same with the Brethren, is as soon as you claim that people can have direct revelation from God, like not different interpretation of the Bible, or let's say like the Pope, right? The Catholic Church, he doesn't claim that like God speaks to him, from what I understand in talking to Catholic people. He is the interpreter of the words that God has given, the interpreter of the Bible. He is supposed to interpret what he believes is the best course of action, and he goes. He doesn't claim that like he's meeting with God and having direct revelation for him. As soon as that becomes a possibility, anything is on the table.
Right.
And that's where so many of the God's taken a turn, right? Or these changes in doctrine, or now a lot of times the LDS Church will say it's not a change in doctrine, it's a change in policy. It's a change in policy. And I'm like, okay, but God's changing his policies, right? So, but then those things can happen, because as soon as you say, well, I received a revelation and this is what we're supposed to do now, well, now all of a sudden these things are important, these things aren't. Or people like Warren Jeffs can become in charge and say, this is a revelation. And now who's supposed to say no to the man who is speaking directly with God?
And this is where it becomes so destructive, right? This is where it just takes it to a whole other level, and it breeds a foundation where we see what's happening now.
Welcome to the Get a Life podcast. Explore survivor stories. Uncover the hidden truths. Join our X-Called conversations. You matter, and so does your story.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Get a Life podcast. I am Cheryl Bottenheimer, or as many of you remember me as Cheryl Hope. And with me today is Ben Woodbury from Australia and Richard Marsh. All three of us are ex-members of the Exclusive Brethren, or as it's known now, the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. I am originally from Maple Creek, Saskatchewan in Canada, and Richard is originally from Cambridge, United Kingdom. And I know you all have been patiently waiting for this podcast, and it is finally here. Today, joining us from Growing Up in Polygamy is Sam and Melissa. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam and Melissa, for taking time out of your extremely busy schedule to come on here and discuss the FLDS and the LDS.
Our pleasure.
We have many questions, but first, I just want to hand the mic over to you, and we would like to hear a little bit about each of you, where you come from, where you are now, and then we can dive into some comparisons and differences between these sects. And then just give the insiders and listeners a little brief intro to your own channel called Growing Up in Polygamy. So I'm going to hand it over to you guys.
Well, thank you so much, Cheryl. We're so excited to be here. And especially since we've had you on our channel, and we're so excited to be able to be on yours as well.
Yes. I'll just give my quick backstory. I've shared bits and pieces of where I'm from, but I'll try to give the smaller version, the quick version of it. I was born and raised in the FLDS community. I was born into a family with 4 moms, and I have 33 siblings. So a very big family. They're in what's called Short Creek is the name of the 2 towns combined, which is Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona. When I was born, Rulon Jeffs was the prophet. And not too long after, when I was about 12 years old, he passed away, and Warren Jeffs, the well-known figure that is now serving a life sentence in prison, became the prophet. And so I was very familiar with him, his family, and met him multiple times, and did have a relationship to some extent with Warren Jeffs himself. I moved out of the FLDS church when I was 18 years old. And later, about a year later, I was introduced to the mainstream LDS church, actually converted and was baptized in the mainstream LDS church, otherwise known as the Mormon church, and spent many years just once again fully believing in the mainstream LDS church, that it was the one true church on earth, as I had believed previous about the FLDS church. And it was through the mainstream LDS church and some mutual friends that I met Melissa.
Yes. I was raised in the mainstream LDS church in Utah. So, Utah Mormon, which has its own culture beast of itself. So, it's a little bit different than maybe even Mormons in Australia or other places around the world. But was raised in a monogamous family because the mainstream LDS church no longer practices polygamy. That's where the breakoff happened a lot of years ago. But yeah, had a great childhood, great family. I would consider my life pretty regular, especially compared to people from Exclusive Brethren or the FLDS. I was raised that I was supposed to be a peculiar people, a little extra modest, more strict rules, but overall much more in the world than a lot of these other groups, being in mainstream Mormonism. And yep, grew up in that, ended up marrying Sam in the St. George LDS temple there. So we were fully in it together, in it to win it. And then about 5 years into our marriage, we started having questions and together went on a big faith journey and transition where we ended up coming out of the mainstream LDS church together as a family.
Yes.
So that's kind of where we are now. In 2020, people would ask Sam all the time about his upbringing and have a lot of questions. And so we had a friend of ours that said, why don't you just make a YouTube channel? And that way, when people ask you, when people first meet him, and he's an open book. So they're like, that way, when people meet you and they want to know more about your upbringing, you can just say, oh, just go check out the YouTube. And we didn't think it would really be that interesting to a lot of other people, but we thought if nothing else, it would be good for our posterity to hear the stories of this community, which is slowly kind of dying off. Like it's not going to be around forever. And so I said, well, if nothing else, at least our kids will be able to hear all the stories of what it was like for you growing up in polygamy. And it turned into something much bigger than we ever expected and has continued to grow. It turns out a lot of people are interested in his story. And now it's become a platform for us to create compassion for people who are in high demand, high control groups. So not just within polygamy, but in other groups as well. And try to let people realize that there's so many more similarities within all of these groups than there even are differences. And if we can help people kind of see some of the similarities in a group that they think is harmful, maybe they can draw that parallel to themselves and realize maybe it's something therein isn't as healthy as they thought it was.
Yeah. And I do want to just point out as well that one of the reasons that I ended up leaving both churches that I was very much involved in, and the first one, the FLDS that I was born into, was finding out that there are hundreds and thousands of these religions, even these very extreme religions, where the people, the members of these religions, would literally give their lives because they are so convinced that it is the one and only true church on the earth. When I found out that I wasn't the only one
that had the full truth,
that believed that I had the full truth, and that so many other people thought they had the only truth, that was faith shattering to hear that they were just as convinced about their belief as I was about mine.
Yeah. And so now we try to help people that are transitioning out of those groups, help you support and a soft landing, especially for those that are leaving polygamous communities, and let them know that they're not alone, and try to help give resources, because when you leave a very controlled, extreme group, it feels like well, you've been taught your whole life that the whole world is super scary. And then you get thrown into it and it is super scary. And you're like, I don't even know basic things, or trying to learn how to go to school, all these type of things. And so now we try to help give resources for people like that who are new to the very big world.
Yep.
Wow. And I think that's one of the main things that I really wanted you guys on here, is to help those that we have a lot of people that we talk to inside that have one foot in, one foot out. And they start just realizing that's that awakening of like, holy crap, like there's other people that think they are the elite people that are the only ones that are going to be saved. And it just shatters that veneer that you wear when you're in there. And all of a sudden you realize, well, how can there be all these other groups out there that have the same belief as I do? Right. And it's super, I think it's so important, the work that we do in trying to really bring to light that this world isn't really big and bad and scary, that it is a very loving world, that there's loving and compassionate people out here that are not going to, and the PBCC was, eat you and chew you and spit you out, right? We're here to hold you, and there's a lot of compassion out here. So thank you for sharing for that. Thank you so much for sharing.
People who've grown up in the Brethren, even my generation, were never allowed to do religious studies lessons at school, and now they're all got their own schools. They probably, the listeners inside, have got no idea what Mormonism or FLDS even is. So perhaps I could ask you just to go back a step. I mean, they would understand what like Church of England or mainstream Christianity is. Can you just do a sort of very quick comparison, explain what Mormonism is, and then what FLDS is, just to kind of set the stage before you?
Yeah. Why don't you start with mainstream Mormonism, and then I'll go with the FLDS.
Yes. Okay. So all different sects of Mormonism, because at this point there are a lot of different ones. There's a lot of different polygamous groups. Typically, a lot of the polygamous groups in America come from these same Mormon roots. And that started with Joseph Smith. So Joseph Smith claimed that he saw a vision where he saw God the Father and Jesus Christ as separate beings of flesh and blood in a vision. And he was praying about which church he should join. And he was told that none of them on the earth were true, and that he needed to restore the true gospel of Jesus Christ on earth. And I'm giving the very short version, but he also claims that he dug up hidden plates that were what's now the Book of Mormon that go hand in hand with the Bible. It's another testament of Jesus Christ, basically a record of the people in the Americas at the same time that the Bible was being written and recorded in, Europe and in the Middle East. And the Book of Mormon is of the American people. So you have these books of scripture, which is where you get the term Mormon from, the belief in the Book of Mormon that Joseph Smith claims he translated. And then he received what we call the power of God, is called the priesthood, where angels actually came and gave him the power of God back restored to this earth. So they believe there was an apostasy of God's power after Christ was crucified and the apostles had died out. There was this apostasy of not really having the true power of God on earth. But he had that fully restored. And I only mention that too because that'll probably get brought up in other things, along with us being the elite chosen people. The fact that there's modern prophets, that they have modern revelation. So Joseph Smith was a prophet. He has the power of God on earth restored. He can now receive revelation for the only true church on earth. And after Joseph Smith died, Brigham Young was our second prophet, and he brought the saints, because the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the full church. So they called themselves saints, and they came to Utah. And that's why Utah is such a huge population of Mormons. But that church, at that point, a couple prophets later, they had been practicing polygamy. Joseph Smith restored polygamy. And then Brigham Young continued to carry it out and spread it. And there was a prophet named Wilford Woodruff who said, no, I got a revelation that we're no longer supposed to practice polygamy.
So basically, in order to gain statehood, the state of Utah had to say, we will no longer practice polygamy because it was illegal, and it is illegal. And so polygamy was a big topic. The first prophet of the restored church, I guess you could say, was Joseph Smith. And some people will claim he never lived polygamy, but there is a lot of evidence that he preached for it and he lived it himself. Brigham Young was a huge lover of polygamy, had multiple wives, and talked very highly of it, that it was not only important in this life, but that it was a celestial law, and that polygamy would be lived on in the eternities. And so it's something that people had to accept on this earth. Following Brigham Young, John Taylor, same thing, spoke very highly of polygamy and of the importance of polygamy to be lived and continued on in this earth. And then followed Wilford Woodruff. And Wilford Woodruff, basically, in order to get the state or the government off of the church's backs and to put an end, and for Utah to become a state, and to put an end to the threats that the government would take their property and things from them, he wrote a manifesto, or at least signed the manifesto, saying that we will no longer practice and live polygamy. And at that point is not when the FLDS church began. But when the FLDS church talks about their prophet line, they do not claim Wilford Woodruff was a prophet anymore because he signed that manifesto. And so for the FLDS church, they believe in Joseph Smith as well, Brigham Young and John Taylor. And then from there, they have a different line of prophets that continued living polygamy and taught of the importance of polygamy. My own grandfather, Charles Zitting, was a very big part of this movement of continuing on with this importance of polygamy because it was taught by the prophets of the church. So when someone comes to me and says, hey, Sam, what's the difference between the FLDS church and the mainstream Mormon church? Members of the mainstream Mormon church do not like it when I say this, but really, if you go back to the way the church was originally restored, the way it was through the days of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, that is very similar to the way the FLDS church is, and in their teachings, and what they find very important is found in the teachings of those original prophets.
Wow.
Of course, people would say, hold on, but what about all of the craziness of Warren Jeffs? Warren Jeffs is crazy. I will admit a lot of things that he did was way out there, and he is still leading the church, even though he is in prison for life. He is still leading the church from his prison cell and still has thousands of followers that believe he's a prophet of God. Okay. Those followers would say, well, look at the Bible. Look at the stories in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
There were prophets put in prison all the time because of religious persecution. This is nothing new. So the followers of Warren Jeffs do not believe he did anything wrong. We know he did, and there's plenty of evidence out there and stories out there about things that he did, child bride and forcing young underage marriages and things like that. So those are the reasons he's in prison. And but if you take away Warren Jeffs and just step back a little bit and look at the overall teachings of the FLDS church, what they believe, what's the fundamentals that they hold on to deeply and strongly, it's what Joseph Smith and Brigham Young taught.
And that's the core doctrine is the same between these different groups. And the FLDS is just one sect that broke off. And so when that manifesto first happened, you'll hear groups like the AUB or the Kingstons or the FLDS. Like his grandfather was friends with who ended up being the prophet of the other polygamous group. It was a huge divide within the church when that manifesto happened, because there were people who were thinking the mainstream LDS church is selling out. They're selling out to get their statehood, and God revealed this for a purpose. He said that it's absolutely crucial to our eternal salvation, and now we're just trying to change God's laws to fit in with man's laws.
It's just a perfect parallel to the Brethren system, even down to the timeline. I mean, if you put John Nelson Darby in the place of Joseph Smith, I think they were contemporary. They had their visions at the same time.
It was busy.
And then you have the line of prophets.
They were at the same party.
Yeah, they all drank the same cocktail. But even down to the division, because I think the sort of Brethren really started off in the 1820s, and around 1860 or 1870, there was a huge split where the open Brethren split off from the exclusive Brethren, and Darby stayed with the exclusive Brethren. That was the conservative original revelation line, and the open Brethren was much more open and conventional. So the open Brethren, you might say, were like the LDS, and the exclusive Brethren like the FLDS, who carried on with the hard line. And it's just the same story. Yes, you have the line of prophets, you have the restoration of what was lost after the original apostles died. You have this succession of named prophets, and then the different branches that split off, they each have the same succession of prophets up to the split, and then they have their own line of prophets after that. So it's just an exact parallel of the Brethren, even down to the years and the dates when it all happened. One thing I'd like you to kind of clarify a little bit. The basic LDS religion is pretty much like mainstream Christianity, but with these extra Mormon books and extra ceremonies bolted onto it. Is that right?
So if you had asked me that when I was still LDS, I would say absolutely. Since leaving, I've learned a lot more of the main differences because growing up LDS, a lot of mainstream Christianity does not accept Mormons as being Christian even. And I was so confused. I was like, it's in the name of our church. We're the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Like, obviously we're Christians. So believing that Jesus Christ is your savior, yes, they're Christian. They're definitely Christian in that way. Believing, like, I think the main differences, though, just for anybody who is listening in that is mainstream Christian and kind of wondering the parallels, we don't believe in the Trinity, which is a very big one for a lot of Christians. So believing that they're separate beings, and then believing that God has a body of flesh and blood and that he's not a spirit, I know is another big one that I hear Christians a lot of times say Mormons aren't Christians if they believe that God is like a body and that you can become a God yourself.
That's what I was going to say.
Is another huge theological difference between Christianity, that God was once, has experienced what we experience, and that our whole goal is to become like him, but not like him as in his angels, as in literally a God of our own worlds. And be able to have our own children on our own planets someday.
Spirit children.
Spirit children, yes.
Quite fun, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. And honestly,
multiple children on a planet? I don't think so.
Yeah.
Well, I think if I had a dozen wives, I would probably be quite glad to escape to my own planet.
I was taught as a girl that part of accepting polygamy, like even though we didn't live it at this time, we had to accept the possibility of it in the eternities because we were going to have to create spirit children to populate a new world. As a girl, like that was going to be part of my role. So the idea of having spirit children and being whatever that looks like for the rest of eternity also sounds exhausting. So I wasn't really, whenever I heard that, I was like, I don't know if I'm down for this. You're saying I'm going to be a polygamous wife, and I'm like, it's my job to populate like this earth and then also like an eternal world forever. I don't know about that.
Hell.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I will say too, the mainstream LDS church is really trying so hard right now to seem more mainstream Christian. And there's even, and I hate to see this because we have a lot of family members that I love and respect that are still in the mainstream Mormon church. But it's almost to the point of gaslighting a little bit because like I recently saw that the LDS Church's website, someone asked, do you believe that people can gain their own worlds? And they said, oh no, that's something people say to characterize us. And then you read deeper and it's like, we believe we can become like God, but we don't believe, but it's very, very clear in the doctrine, especially early doctrine and in other things that they say all the time. Like it's very clear that that's part of the doctrine. But then if somebody from the outside asks, they'll try to like go around it because that sounds crazy, right? Well, and I'm like, that was the part that we thought was cool. Like my mom was a convert and she's like, that's the part that made us like unique, is that we could become like God. And they're trying to like water it down a little bit so that other Christians will accept us.
So like the PBCC.
I was going to say, it's not
they
dissimilar.
Rebranded as the PBCC just so they could get the words Christian Church into their name to try and make it look as if they're a mainstream Christian church. And every time they screw up and get into trouble and they get bad press, their spokesman always says, we're a mainstream Christian church. And well, I mean, if you're a mainstream Christian church, I'm a pink rabbit with blue flashing lights for eyes. I mean, holy cow.
It's not dissimilar at all. Like even just hearing the way, I know it's going back a bit, that Samuel was saying about him, still having followers being in prison, it wouldn't be dissimilar to the psychological effect it would happen on the brethren if Bruce Hales went to prison. They would still, we've had leaders before being caught being unfaithful, and I think it's too much gymnastics mentally to try and take all that in and rewrite, I guess, a new course of life when all your life you've been told you're a chosen people, a special people, peculiar for zealous for good works. So I even down to that, there are so many similarities.
Yeah.
So the Book of Mormon, like the Book of Mormon, is considered your Bible, right?
No.
No.
No. So the Book of Mormon goes hand in hand with the Bible. They still do read the Bible. In fact, even growing up in the FLDS church, I'm stepping away from the mainstream and just in the little FLDS fundamentalist church, the Bible was very much talked about as a very important book to read. Now, one big thing they would say, though, is that the Book of Mormon is a perfect book because it was given to Joseph Smith on these plates of gold that were and these words were written down by prophets of old. And then it was only translated one time. Joseph Smith himself, by the power of God, translated word for word to get the Book of Mormon. So therefore, it's perfectly written the way God intends it to be. So they would say, we believe, and this is one of their articles of faith, that the Book of Mormon is the word of God, and that the Bible is the word of God as long as it is translated correctly. So they're saying the Bible is a good book. However, if there's something in there that we don't want to agree with, we can easily say that's obviously a mistranslation.
But
And
that again is exactly what the brethren do. J.N. Darby translated the Bible. He did his own translation. And that, as we were all brought up to know, is the only true translation of the Bible. All the other translations are defective.
Joseph Smith started trying to do that before he was killed, actually.
Yeah.
He did start, and we have the first few chapters of the Bible. And yeah, that's crazy because, yeah, Joseph Smith did the same thing. He was working on the retranslation of the Bible. And then when he died, Brigham Young didn't continue that on. But we do have a whole book at the end of our Doctrine and Covenants. It's called The Pearl of Great Price. And that's where he starts to retranslate the Bible. So it definitely would have been on the list if he had continued, if he hadn't been killed.
Yeah.
I think your Book of Mormon is kind of equivalent to what the brethren call the ministry, which is like the great writings of the leaders, and is always held alongside the Bible as being equivalent.
So we have what's called the Doctrine and Covenants,
which is
the modern day prophets. So it started with Joseph Smith, and then after a few prophets, they realized they weren't going to continue to add on and get this huge book. So now members are just told that when there's general conferences, when there's conferences where they speak twice a year to the whole church as a whole, then you're told to read and study those as the most modern revelation, right? But there is a whole book called Doctrine and Covenants that is modern prophets and mostly Joseph Smith and some Brigham Young sharing core doctrines of the restoration. So even then, so I'd say that's probably more similar, the modern prophets. The Book of Mormon is really interesting in a lot of ways. There's a lot of excerpts. I think it's 104 pages that are literally just exact copies of the Bible, which we were told growing up was because the same Sermon on the Mount that Christ gave when he was resurrected, that he then came to the people of the Americas and gave that same sermon. And that's why that sermon is in the Book of Mormon. But I was raised and told and taught, and it still says in the front of my Book of Mormon that I was given when I was baptized at 8 years old, that it was a record of the Native American people, that this was literally the same way that you look at the Bible as a history book of the world for Christians that look at it as history. This is the history of the American people. And it was because a prophet fled Jerusalem and took his family across on a boat. And literally all Native Americans all come from this lineage, right? And this is another thing that the LDS Church has had to back away on because they're very big on DNA and ancestry. And they can now prove that the Native Americans don't have Middle Eastern heritage at all.
White people, I tell you.
Yeah. So now they've actually changed the front of I had to go into my old Book of Mormon the other day because I was trying to read the preface page, and in mine it says this is a history of the Native American people, of the Native American people. And then now if you go and get a Book of Mormon, it doesn't say that anymore. It says this is a history of one of the peoples. They say one of the people, so they can say, well, it's not all the people, and most of them died off. So that there's not a conflict of interest. They actually changed that wording. But that's how I was taught, is that it's a literal history of the religious tribulations and wars and things that happened in the Americas at the same time that the Bible was being written in.
I wanted to ask, so in the PBCC, right? rules change all the time. We call it the Lord did a turn, and there's like a U-turn happening here and a U-turn happening
Yeah,
there.
the Lord made a turn.
The Lord made a turn. Yeah.
Everyone's
So,
got whiplash, but
and so one of the things I wanted to ask you is like, was the Book of Mormon, other than this preface that has been changed, has anything ever changed inside it? And what kind of rules have changed along the way? Like, do you get whiplash from rules changing on either side,
my
the
gosh.
FLDS or the LDS? I really want the listeners and the insiders to hear this, that like, this is what happens inside a high demand religious sect.
I don't know if we have the time to talk about things that have changed, but
Because there's
first,
been so many.
because there's been so many. But first, I should say, the Book of Mormon itself, as far as changes within the book, I've heard of like one where they changed some very racist passages.
Yeah. So here's the thing, though.
Yeah.
In the FLDS church, they love the words in the Book of Mormon. They would never want to change it because they don't care about society.
Even the racist stuff.
The racist stuff, the stuff about whether it's sexist or racist or whatever, because it was written back in those days.
Yeah.
The FLDS still holds true to that. They don't want to follow society because they say God doesn't change. These are God's words. This is his work. Why would we just follow society? If anything, we should be going away from society because they are changing. And so the FLDS doesn't change the core doctrine. However, then you have people like Warren Jeffs come, that he adds on all of these extra rules on top of what they already have.
Modern revelation, right? So
Yes.
the scripture has stayed pretty much the same. There's only like one or two things that I believe have changed within the Book of Mormon. And it was like, tweaking one word. So instead of it being racist, we can like kind of go around it. Because they were taught that the Lamanites, like the bad people in the Book of Mormon, they were cursed with dark skin. That's why the Native Americans have brown skin. And which is horrible, like that it's a curse. Yeah. And that when they become righteous and they accept the gospel of Jesus Christ again, that their skin could be lightened. And it was saying that their skin would become exceedingly white. Yep. And then they took out the word skin. But so instead of that, they would just become delightsome.
A delightsome people.
Instead of skin.
A light-skinned delightsome, they change it to delightsome.
So that's as far as I know.
This is not dissimilar to the Brethren either. Like we have... You'll find it's a highly white community. And when I asked a while back a lot of ex-members on a social page as to why was the rule, like we always knew that interracial marriages weren't allowed. And the general consensus from everybody that knew, I guess, the rules that were spoken about back then was they were not comely, interracial, like, which means are not good to look at, like a interracial marriage. So it's a very, very similar undertones, I guess you could say.
Wow. Well, as horrible as that is, and that, I mean, yeah, that's just horrible and awful and blatantly racist. I'd still say that is a step above. That's still better than what he was taught in the FLDS. Is the reason that there's no interracial marriage is because people of color, they were unrighteous in the war in heaven. And they didn't pick the Lord's side. So cursed spirits are going into cursed bodies.
And now they were referring specifically to Black people.
Yes, I should see that.
Not just people of color. They were referring to Black people, that they were not valiant in the war in heaven, and they didn't choose to fight on God's side. Therefore, they were cursed and became as Cain, cursed in the Bible. And they are basically these bad people that we were told if we and I was reminded this when I left the church, that my mother was very, very sad and very just completely torn apart and heartbroken that I left, because I was giving up that connection, that eternal family within the FLDS church. We weren't allowed to go back. So basically you're shunned from the community if you do choose to live a different lifestyle. And I was reminded that, hey, do not marry a Black person, because you will be forever cursed.
You curse your posterity.
You'll curse you and your posterity by just marrying interracially like that. So it was intense.
Wow. So does the LDS believe this? Like, does the mainstream Mormon, like, and truthfully, like, is
not
there
anymore.
Still bits, but did they?
Yes. So it's not anymore. Like Worldwide Church, they're definitely they've tried to really squash that, the racism portion. There is a lot of racist history still, because it was Brigham Young who taught that the curse on Cain was the curse of dark skin. And so he taught that. And then anybody who is Black was not allowed to have the priesthood. So if you were a Black man, you couldn't have the priesthood until the 70s, when that was changed. And even now, like when people get asked that question, one, there's a lot of people that have either converted or they just don't hear these parts of history.
Yeah.
Right? They're getting the good skim stuff, the good, oh, we're Christians who believe in treating everyone really well. And I mean, if you know anybody who's Mormon, they are some of the nicest people you will ever meet, right? And so it's very much like, if you only know the surface level, then a lot of times you don't hear about this stuff. You have to look into it to find it. But yes, there's lots of racist comments from past prophets. There's definitely the racism within the Book of Mormon. Yes, the fact that they didn't have the priesthood for so long, that it's just obviously blatantly racist. And then they say, okay, well, now it's the time. And I've seen even in recent talks when people get asked that question and they say, oh, the question shouldn't be why a Black person couldn't have the priesthood until the 70s. The question should be why it took till the 1800s that white people could. Like things like that. Like the whole world. The whole world had to wait for the priesthood. Why did God wait to give his children the priesthood in the first place? Those 100 years aren't the important part. It's the fact that the whole world had to wait. And I'm like, it's just so obviously, it's so frustrating and so blatantly racist. Wow. And now they're trying to get away from it because, again, since they have allowed people of color to have the priesthood, and now it's a global church, and they have a lot of representatives now that are Black people who say, like, I was able to look past that, and I know that this is still what God wants, and he has to do it in the right times to be able to have it be okay with society. And whether or not you believe that God should be ahead of the curve or behind the curve on racism is really what it comes down to for me.
Yeah,
personally.
it's frustrating because it's very obvious they're just changing with the times. They're not ahead of the times or behind the times. They're just going along with what society says. So hey, moving along with society, great. But they claim to have this perfect connection with God, where the prophets of the church are actually communicating with God. They're receiving revelation from him constantly. So,
if you're going to claim that, then you should do better.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's not dissimilar
right back
to the
that
brethren.
original division where they gave up polygamy, not because God changed his plan, but because they wanted to be a state in the USA. So suddenly they get a revelation from God that just happens to come at the right time to let them do that, which is again so like the brethren. If something suddenly appears to be potentially profitable in a financial sense, suddenly they have a revelation that suddenly it's okay to do this. No connection
Lord made it turn
between the two.
I was going to say it's not dissimilar at all, in the same way that the brethren appeared with the charity to look like they are a mainstream Christian church, to do great works for the wider community, because they don't allow the wider community to come to the church because they're not a public church. So you can't really call yourself a mainstream Christian church if you're not open to the public. It's just little things like that it seems so similar.
Yeah, I think that one thing too that separates from like mainstream Christianity with Mormonism, and it sounds like it's the same with the brethren, is as soon as you claim that people can have direct revelation from God, like not different interpretation of the Bible, or let's say like the Pope, right? The Catholic Church, he doesn't claim that like God speaks to him, from what I understand in talking to Catholic people. He is the interpreter of the words that God has given, the interpreter of the Bible. He is supposed to interpret what he believes is the best course of action, and he goes. He doesn't claim that like he's meeting with God and having direct revelation for him. As soon as that becomes a possibility, anything is on the table.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's where so many of the God's taken a turn, right? Or these changes in doctrine, or now a lot of times the LDS Church will say it's not a change in doctrine, it's a change in policy. It's a change in policy. And I'm like, okay, but God's changing his policies, right? So, but then those things can happen, because as soon as you say, well, I received a revelation and this is what we're supposed to do now, well, now all of a sudden these things are important, these things aren't, or people like Warren Jeffs can become in charge and say,
Yeah.
this is a revelation. And now who's supposed to say no to the man who's speaking directly with
Yeah.
God?
And this is where it becomes so destructive, right? This is where it just takes it to a whole other level, and it breeds a foundation where we see what's happening now, right? Like it's just a breeding ground for, to me, in my opinion, it's just evil that comes out of it.
Yeah.
I want to go back to, Sam, what you were saying earlier about your mom being absolutely distraught over you leaving, and you used the word shunning. Can you talk a little bit more about that experience? Just because I know those that have left the PBCC and those that are inside will really be able to relate to some of those words that you used. And I want them to realize that, this in the PBCC, it's called the doctrine of separation. Sounds like it's very similar to the FLDS.
Yeah. Thank you. So yes, in the FLDS church, we were taught that the outside world was wicked, first and foremost. That people that were not a part of the church it was impossible for them to be happy. They were in some way or another on Satan's ground and being controlled by him. And that those poor Gentiles, as we called them, would maybe one day, if they wanted to and were living good lives, just not within the church, would get an opportunity to hear the truth and accept the truth that we had, if at one point they were lucky enough. But we were the lucky ones that were born into the covenant. We were born into the church, the one true church. Now, an apostate is someone that leaves the church. I believe you've referred to them as leavers.
We get called apostates too. It's very
apostates. Similar. Okay. So an apostate was a whole different thing. If you have the church, you're born into the church, and then you choose to leave it, you are the worst of the worst. You are giving up what is most important in this life and the eternities. You are accepting the fact that you will be damned to hell and live an eternity of suffering and loneliness. And that you are, because of those choices, you are no longer welcome to be back in the community, mingling and spreading your wickedness and your what do they call it? I guess influence on the community. So it was a very, very big deal. And it was sad because, I saw it happen before I left. I saw it happen with older siblings or other people in the community that did choose to leave. And just the amount of judgment and hatred that I felt and that the community members felt towards them, believing, because of the way we were taught, that they were going to leave, they were going to be immediately controlled by Satan. They were going to they're going to spend the rest of their days fighting against the church, trying to bring down God's work and put an end to it. So, and that they were going to be immediately into drugs. They're going to become alcoholics. They're going to be raped. They're going to be, you name it. That was going to happen to these people because of the way we were taught. So it was very scary to even consider leaving the church, not to mention the fact that the rift that you created in your family and the broken hearts and the sadness. I bring up the way that we looked towards apostates just to give an idea of how hard it was as a parent. I was the child leaving, but my mother and my father both were just absolutely crushed. I was one of the first of my siblings to leave. And so when I did choose to leave, it's hard to even put into words just the sobbing and the begging. Please don't leave. You know this is the truth. How could you possibly just throw aside what we had taught you is the truth? And at 18 years old, I was at a point in my life where, sure, I maybe didn't have a fully developed brain. And honestly, I look back now and I think I wish I would have handled it a little differently. I took for granted the relationship that I had with my parents. I didn't realize how quickly that would be torn apart from me and just how different things would be. But I was also in a point in my life where I had to make the decision, am I going to live my life or am I going to live the life that Warren Jeffs or that the community is going to force me to live. I had to make a decision for myself, and it was a very, very hard decision. And even at the moment that I left the church, I still believed it was true. And I thought to myself, you know, I'll probably go out there and prove to myself that everything I had been taught about the outside world is true. And then I'm going to be running back, begging, and trying to be accepted back into the community, because I thought that was the only way I would return to live with God. But I came to a point where I felt like I had to at least try to, and I remember at age about 16 thinking, because of all of the strict rules, they're not allowed to date, they're not allowed to listen to music, not allowed to watch TV, not allowed to have any fun, just work. Honestly, even the word fun was taken out of the vocabulary of the FLDS people. And at 18, I'm like, this sucks. I don't like this life. And I remember thinking, at 16, I remember thinking, if I find out one day that this is not true, I'm going to be pissed. This is going to be like, I cannot handle that. So at age 18, I had to find out for myself.
Part 2 today.
Yes. And okay. And one other thing that kind of led this on was I had met people outside of the community, because even though we were very secluded and very much in a bubble, we did meet outsiders because we would go out and do construction work. And so we would do remodel jobs sometimes on people's homes, and we would meet these people just in conversation about what they wanted and needed done on their home. And in dealing with some of these people, I realized these don't seem like unhappy, miserable, awful people like I'm told that they are. And so that was another thing that created this curiosity that I felt that I needed to go prove to myself if the outside world is what they claimed it was. And it took about 3 months, maybe even 4, before I started realizing, after I had left, that no, I was lied to. There are a lot of really good people out here. You can have a really good life out here, much better than the life that I was raised with. And the amount of opportunity and freedom that I felt was overwhelming. And so really at this point, the only thing that I really have a hard time with is just not having that relationship with my family.
I want the insiders that are listening right now to just pause. I want you to even just pause the video that you're watching, or if you're listening to it, I want you to just to pause, and I want you to take in everything that Sam just said, because I know every word he spoke is a carbon copy of the PBCC and what it's like to leave. And I want you just to feel it in your body of like, how can two groups believe that they are the one? And just pause it right here. Just take 3 minutes. And I just want you to sit with that and just breathe through and realize it's impossible.
Even down to the very, the way you're speaking, Sam, about experiencing leaving in front of your own family. And I did the same thing. And when people ask me what that is like, and I saw you like struggling for words for it, the only thing that I could ever come to was that it's like you're dying and you're witnessing your family's reaction to it.
Yeah.
You're watching your family go through the grieving process of trying to save your life and keep you alive whilst you literally physically walk out of the house. And that's what I said to a lot of people that have helped leave is, do not leave in front of your family. It's so traumatic. Yeah. Try it if you're up for it, but it's so traumatic.
I love that you brought that up, and thank you, because that is a very good way to put it. And I would even go a step further and say that in their eyes, it is worse than losing you to death.
Yeah.
I was told that, actually. I was told I was with some other of my brothers in a really, really bad accident where I was in a coma for 3 days. Some of my brothers were in a coma for an entire month. And we were told, after we all survived, that we would have been much better off dying in that moment than to ever leave the church. So just to put it into perspective.
Again,
very, very similar word choices. You know, we're taught all our lives we're better off to die than to leave. And then one worse is, and I think you were saying earlier about when you leave, you're apostate. We kind of got a bit of grace, like you'd get shut up or confined, they call it, then you get withdrawn from. But then there's one worse to come up and speak up against the church like we have, then you're an apostate. So I just sort of make that part clear. We don't just become apostates. But yeah, it's very, very similar. Everything's very similar.
And
I
Bruce
guess
Hales,
it kind of loses its credibility then, doesn't it? It's in the same way that you had artists painting, iconic scenes like Mary and the muses they were using. If they used common people back in the day when, you had some great masters painting these scenes, they would get in trouble for using commoners because it devalued the morality, I guess, or the immortality of the icons. In the same way, if you're learning that there are other cults or churches or groups that have the exact same principles, as the exact same following, it kind of devalues it all. That's why you don't learn about it in there. It really makes it common, I guess. You're not a peculiar people zealous for good works.
Right.
Peculiar in one sense of the word, maybe.
Yeah.
yeah. Going back to how you're talking about like being apostate. So Bruce Hales, I'll see if I can find it, but he actually has this layer of like hell and leaving, and people who leave and speak out against the church are worse off. They have a different place in hell than people who are even pedophiles. That's how bad he considers it.
Wow.
Oh yeah, it's considered within Mormonism. It's called outer darkness because you become a son of perdition, right? Like fighting against the church or denying the Holy Ghost is the one sin that is like the worst thing, and then you get sent to outer darkness, which isn't even hell. It's like its own thing. And then we've been told from girls who have left that the women within the FLDS are told that, sons of perdition are for the men that leave and fight against the church. And they're told that as women, their spirit completely disintegrates. There is no life at all after death. Like you don't even have the right to be eternally tortured. You will turn into matter, right? I know. I was thinking that, but you should have seen the terror in this girl's eyes. She was like, it was the most terrifying thing to think that there wasn't even a place for me. I was gonna turn into nothingness. Now, I'm not even, which is crazy.
If you're an atheist, then you're just like, okay, yeah, no big deal. but you have to put into perspective though what these people are feeling, because we were told, and I guess we'll see if it was the same for you guys, but we were told that this life is of such insignificance as far as the big scheme of things in the eternities. All you have to do is prove your obedience here. Just be obedient. That's it. This life is a blip. It's not that long. Just be obedient for 80 years, move on. Cool. And then your life actually begins. So for this girl, this life was just like this little tiny piece of the big scheme of things. And if you just make that one mistake in this life, then your entire
eternity is gone.
Purpose is gone, just like
career,
that. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. She doesn't even
get
to
populating for you.
So let's dive in more to the women now that we're talking about the women. So what were the women's roles in the FLDS particularly, right? Because it was a little bit more, it was like the exclusive brethren, right? Mm-hmm. Like what was expected of the women?
Okay, so primary purpose in this life was to get married at whichever age the prophet said you were ready to get married, and to whom the prophet decided you were supposed to get married to, and have as many children as possible. Anything, birth control of any kind was not allowed. That would be going against God's plan and preventing his will. And they were literally, that was the purpose, was to raise children. That would be the only way to really be fulfilled in this life.
And to honor and listen to their husbands.
Yes. And of course, the husband was in charge because he held what they called the priesthood, which is simply put, the power of God given to man on earth. And through that priesthood, he held this position above all else in the home. So the mothers would obey the father. And I say mothers because, of course, we practice polygamy. Would obey the father as the head of the house, the leader, the one in charge. And then the children would obey him, and the mothers would enforce his rules. And then, of course, the father of the home was supposed to obey perfectly the prophet of the church. So it was a hierarchy in that way.
And a little bit of that hierarchy is within mainstream church too. Like when Sam and I got married in the LDS temple, my covenant was to obey my husband as he obeys God. So I didn't covenant directly with God to obey God. It's my job to obey my husband, and he obeys as he obeys God.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So, and then as far as just day-to-day life, I just growing up with my sisters in the home, we all were raised in the same home together. My sisters were on one end of the house in different rooms, and me and the boys were on the other end of the house in different rooms. We were separated by gender, and then we were separated by age. So some rooms had multiple different beds, and bunk beds were very common. In my home, all four of the mothers had their own room, and then my father had his own room. And then as far as day to day, the boys, me at about 13 or 14 years old, I was out on job sites working full time. And the schooling that we got was homeschooling up until that point. And the boys would often be out working, whether it was, if we were younger, it was around the yard or on job sites. And then the girls were in charge of the house, the laundry, the dishes, the food, and then, of course, helping the mothers with the young children as well.
Okay.
Did you relate to your biological mother, or were all of the mothers in the house your mother?
Yes, great question. So my mother, it was very clear who you belonged to. I called my mother, and I say mother and father because we were not allowed to use mom and dad. That was considered disrespectful. And so it was, you couldn't just go up and say, hey, mom, what's life like? Or, hey, dad, it was very different. It was like they were the rulers of the home. And it was like, mother, may I have a slice of bread? It was just a different, and hugging, we didn't really hug that much. I mean, when I meet my father, if I met my father today, he would stick out his hand for a handshake. It was just very different. Than it is. And I took that experience and wanted to flip it around. And so I am very lovey-dovey to my kids. But anyway, so that's
a very similar trait to Sam, like just even in my own personal experience. I know it's not all the same with the brethren, but my family in particular were very devoid of emotion, I guess, for want of a better word, because I guess if there was emotion attached, then things like letting your son leave would not be as easy as it has been for them, I guess, in one sense. I mean, not that it hasn't been, but yeah, it's very same, like no hugging, no. And I think that's one thing we all like really struggled with coming out here. Your best mates would greet you with a hug or something, and you're like, ugh. What are you doing?
Yeah, we can get to that too. It was very awkward at first.
Well, and I always joke that I always have to teach his siblings, when a sibling leaves, then I have to teach them how to hug.
Yeah.
Like his brothers. Like there was one brother that left, and he left pretty young, like as soon as he turned 18. And he went to like give me a hug, and he kind of did like this awkward like side thing, because they're told they can't hug a girl like full frontal hug is like, woo.
You're not even supposed to hug a girl at all.
Let alone. So he gives me this awkward hug, and I was like, just so you know, next time I expect a real hug. And so the next time he gave me like a little bit better of a hug. And then it was like a year after he had left, he came up and gave me a big hug, and he's like, look at what I just did. Are you so proud of me? I can hug you. Like I've been working on it. So it's cute to watch that transition.
The relationship between parents and children was very different, but we did know, and I called my mother. And then the other mothers, let's say their first name was Lisa, we would say Mother Lisa. We would just call them by their first name after mother on there. So, and that did change over time. There was a time period where we called them Aunt Lisa, for example. Like instead of mother, we called them Aunt, even though they played the role of a mother in the home. So I was raised with 4 mothers in the home, and that was very common to me, and I did respect them all as mothers, but I did have a closer bond with my biological mother.
And they had to be obedient to all the mothers too. Like all of them had to be respected as mothers. It wasn't like, oh, this mother's not letting me do what I want. Like they had to.
Did
you know which mothers to go to?
If one mother said no, we would of course try the next mother until someone said yes. We would, we had to take advantage of the polygamy thing.
Got to be some positives, right?
I want to jump ship here into another topic. I want to talk about the end of times. And in the PBCC, it was known as the rapture. So in either the LDS or the FLDS, what was that terminology used for that? Was that a thing? Was there a second coming of Christ? Was there a rapture? Yeah, explain what that was like for each of you.
So you go
I
with
should
yours
go first
and
because
then
mine's more simple.
yes.
So growing up, definitely second coming of Christ. I was constantly told that I was the chosen generation that was going to be preparing the church for the second coming. The word chosen generation got thrown around a lot in youth camps, in Sunday school, in seminary, everywhere. That people would honor and revere us in heaven for being, dealing with these wicked times and preparing the earth for the second coming. So it's definitely talked about. But I will say, and there was a lot of emphasis on food storage was a big thing in the 90s, particularly when I was young. The prophet at the time was Gordon B. Hinckley. He was very big on getting food storage, being ready, that prepper mentality, like the time is nigh. We don't know exactly when, but it's coming soon type thing. The mainstream church has shied away from that a lot now. Like if you asked somebody in their early 20s now, if they feel like the time's going to be any time now, they would say probably not. They're like, no, it'll come when it comes, whatever. It doesn't have the same emphasis that there was a lot of push in the 80s and 90s. And now it's kind of simmered away. They don't put as much. They say like, oh, be prepared. But it's not the same like, okay, you need to have 3 years worth of food storage. Like we would get like lists, like this is the amount of wheat you need. This is the amount of water you need. This is the amount of like, and I remember even when we first got married 10 years ago, going into my pantry with like a checklist that the church gave me of like, I need to make sure I have this much rice, this much beans, this much wheat to be prepared. And they've shied away a lot from that. So now I don't think that there's an element of fear. I was never scared because we were taught that like, yeah, but we're the righteous ones, so we're going to be just fine in the second coming. Like it's all the bad people that are going to be destroyed. But like I said, now it's a lot less talked about and they're shying away from it more.
Yeah.
And is it like Jesus coming or God or like what was the previous prophet or?
Yeah, so it's going to be Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
So that we believe that it's Jesus Christ will come and then the righteous will know that he's there before. Oh, let me try to remember all my details. But like the righteous will know that he's come even before like the rest of the world would know, basically. And then that would be the start of the millennium. So then after destructions and stuff would happen, then you'd have that 1,000 years of peace where we'd be able to convert the entire world to Mormonism. And have everyone would have the opportunity to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ and be able to get their ordinances done. Because the mainstream LDS church has a very specific path of ordinances that you have to have done, it's a little bit different in the sense that there's works that need to be proven. It's not just believing in Jesus Christ and accepting him as your savior. You have to be baptized. You need to receive ordinances in the temple. So that 1,000 years is going to be filled and flooded with a lot of work of people getting all these ordinances done that are necessary to receive the highest degree of exaltation.
Yeah. So what was the food storage about? Was it thought that there was going to be big wars and disasters just before the second coming? Is that the food storage deal?
Exactly, right? Like all the things that are in Revelations and all the things that are going to be happening before the second coming, we needed to be ready and prepared for that. So, that's exactly what it was. And then every time something would happen, everybody, it was like a faith promoting thing. Like, aren't you? Well, not only that, but okay. Oh, we have all this food storage. Nothing's happened. But then like a hurricane would happen and people would be grateful that they had their food storage. So it'd be this faith promoting like, well, then food storage slowly became for, instead of it being ready for the second coming, now it's just good to have it because natural disasters can happen. Your electricity can go out. Being prepared is good. And now it's turned into like, oh, be prepared if you have room. Like if you can, it's okay. So it slowly got kind of watered down from being like, be ready for destructions to, it's good to have a little extra
corner on that one a little.
No one's as scared.
It'll come back. I mean, I'll bet in 10 years' time the old LDS will all be in full rapture mode again. Because these things all go in cycles, don't they? They have
most
definitely. And like, the brethren, I think, are where you suggested the LDS were at back in the 80s. Like it's they're a bit more behind the times, and it's a very integral, like it's a very important part of the Brethren culture, though, because it's a tool whereby the leader, gets off the fray, off the edge, or keeps the troops closer, because you're going to miss out on this rapture and you'll be stuck here during, will be the end of time. And they have all sorts of quotes like, there won't be enough policemen, government won't last 3 days, there won't be enough policemen, even if there's one on each street. Like, they have all these things to, so
there'll
that
be no
help
nurses to run the hospitals, so all the hospitals will go crazy. Yeah. And airplanes will fall out the sky because the pilot will be raptured and all the sinners will crash into the ground.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And I will say, too, that the church's massive growth into being a worldwide church now of like 16 million members has really changed a lot from the core doctrine, which Sam will go into. The way he was raised, with 10,000 members, is much more the fundamental doctrine of the church and how the second coming was taught. Because once you have 16 million members that are worldwide, originally it was taught that there would be a literal gathering place. We were all meant to go to Missouri, right? And that the lifting up and like there's a literal gathering of Israel. And I was taught that in like the early years of seminary, like as a young teenager, there's a literal gathering. And then all of a sudden we got so big that it was like, literal gathering doesn't make sense. The stakes being gathered
virtually gather.
Now it's like, okay, now that means like with the stakes of Zion being gathered now means that like stakes within like your community. So each community is going to gather and you're going to have each other to rely on. And so now it became more this idea of like, okay, I wasn't going to have to move to Missouri, which the original saints did think that. And the FLDS have prophesied that they are going to have to be in a certain physical location and gather together to be ready for the second coming. And so the mainstream church kind of had to get away from that because it's going to be impossible to try to gather.
That's the great thing about religion as compared to science, that in religion you can just make shit up.
Yeah, speaking of making stuff up, the FLDS church, of course, took everything to the extreme and held on to the way that it originally was. They did talk about the second coming of Jesus Christ, but the more common word was, or saying, was the great destructions. And they would go into detail because that was the thing about the FLDS church is they would
their downfall.
Use all of these details to try to make it seem more realistic, more real, more urgent. And so even to the point of setting dates that, hey, this is the date that it's going to happen. If you're not prepared, you will be destroyed. So it would put the sense of urgency on it. And they would say things like, Russia will come from the east and China will come from the west. The people will be pouring over the mountains here and coming in airplanes over here to just destroy us. And literally saying that the entire world and all of the countries were going to come to attack against those 10,000 people because Satan would be in control of them. And so the only people in this world that they would want to attack would be those 10,000 people. Forget the 7 billion, 10,000 people. That's all that matters. Let's go kill them. And so it was very much put on us that we were so special and that the entire world was looking at us. I had no idea that there were people across in Australia or wherever that didn't know about me.
Or even in America.
I assumed everybody knew about me because Satan was whispering in their ears, hey, there's this peculiar people over here. Go get them.
Was it in Missouri?
No, so this was in the growing up in Colorado City and Hilldale.
Okay.
There in Short Creek. So that's just in southern Utah and northern Arizona is where the place that I grew up in was, and very well known for the FLDS people.
Yeah,
but they're gonna now the new revelations that Warren Jeffs has come out with is that they are going to be starting to gather.
Right. And there are people that are going to Missouri, and there are plenty fundamentalists that are not FLDS that have gathered in Missouri because they're holding on to those original teachings from the prophets and just waiting for the second coming of Christ and still believing that it's going to be in Missouri. So a lot of polygamists and fundamentalists are living there. But
the mainstream prophets are a lot smarter and not trying to come up with new revelations that can be so easily disproven, right? Like, you don't get dates.
The rapture date is going to be after they're dead, so if it doesn't happen, they don't look stupid.
Ooh, yes. And speaking of the date, so of course, Warren Jeffs specifically, and even before him, Rulon Jeffs, would set these dates that this is when the destructions are going to happen. And then, of course, they didn't happen. And when they didn't happen, guess what? It wasn't their fault. They said, I spoke to God. That's what God said. The reason it didn't happen is because the people of this church were not prepared. You were not righteous enough. It is your fault. He has set a new date now, and we have to be ready for this time. He's giving you one last chance. If you blow this one, you'll be destroyed. You'll just be poof, gone.
Sound familiar? Stay tuned for part 2 as we continue to uncover many more similarities. How can you support Get a Life podcast? You can donate internationally via PayPal at www.paypal.me/getalifepodcast. PayPal also has a QR code that can be scanned. Or donate to our Get a Life podcast GoFundMe. If you're in a high-demand religious group and need help, please go to oliveleaf.network. To share your story or be a guest on the show, email info.getalife@proton.me. Check out www.get-a-life.net for Get a Life merchandise, books, and ways to support or get support. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to Get a Life, and comment.